Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Android users can find us and subscribe on your Play Music app. Apple users can find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Stitcher. You can follow us on Spreaker. And you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that we can spread the word. Let's get into the show. Welcome to this show, this episode, the 91st episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, I hesitate to say that, Clara.
I know, yeah. Kelly ruined you.
I can't say it with vigor anymore.
You have your own identity.
I do.
You can say, and Clara.
There. That's it. Thank you.
That's
that was
it.
a good intro. Thank you,
So,
James.
the 91st episode of this podcast, that means we've been doing this for... How long now? I can't even remember when we started.
Well,
I feel like I should know our beginning date. I think it was, I think it's been March of 2018. Is that right? Could it be that long?
I don't know.
Wow.
Well, if it's the 91st, there's 52 weeks in a year.
Yeah.
We missed a couple weeks in between, but we need to plan something special for the 100th.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's coming up quickly.
It is.
So in this episode, we are going to talk about something that Mom saw that our good friend PK Hill posted on her Facebook page, and she borrowed it from somebody else, and I don't have it up right now, so I can't tell you the original source. But it was a list of when leadership does these things. And we just decided to kind of hone in on two of these because I think these are really important issues and a lot of things that are going on right now. So the two that we are focusing in on are when leadership attacks the advocate and when they deceive the trusting. Leadership, I think, can be broadly defined. We're not specifically talking about church leadership or anything like that. Just people who are out there leading and they have a voice and other people are following. I would define this pretty broadly. The reason that we wanted to focus on the attacks on the advocate is because I'm seeing a lot of this. I mean, it's always been around, but I'm seeing a lot of this in recent months, where genuinely good advocates are just being attacked, and sadly by some other advocates. It's really difficult to be an advocate, and most, if not all, advocates have a personal story of pain and injury that have happened in their personal lives, and they're really out there. I mean, the vast majority of advocates who I know are really out there trying to make a difference and trying to prevent abuse and shine a light on abuse that happens. So, this is kind of a little bit of a soapbox of mine, but it's really not helpful when other advocates are being called out by other advocates for all this little stupid petty stuff. I think it's an extreme waste of time. I know from times that I've been attacked, which, thankfully has not been very often, but it's exhausting and it wears you down. It's a waste of time. It makes you less productive. You have to constantly fight this barrage of senseless attacks. And I think we can be better than that.
Oh, yeah. It's easy to say ignore it when someone says something or calls you out on something that you know isn't true, and you want to combat that, but it's difficult to do that. It's draining. It's tiresome, it's emotionally draining, and it's hurtful.
Well, and it takes the focus away from people who really genuinely need help.
Absolutely.
And every day, all the advocates get bombarded with requests from people who are just desperate for help. And we've talked about that on this podcast before. There's no way that we can field all of the emails and calls for help that we receive. So there are legitimately far more people out there who need help than what we'll ever be able to provide help for. So every time any kind of leadership, or anybody else for that matter, attacks advocates over petty things, it just really detracts from that, and it takes time and resources and energy away from people who legitimately need help. So some of the things and some of the reasons, I guess, why people attack advocates is they're just looking for faults in others. And maybe that's partly because they have a history of some kind of abuse, and they just, are really geared towards finding faults in people and calling that out, which is not always a bad thing. We should shine light when people are really doing evil. We should shine a light on that. But it's, I don't know. Does that make sense? Like, I think
it does, but there's a limit to the calling out that we need to do. And there's a proper way to do it.
And there just comes a point where it gets annoying. It's just flat out annoying when you're constantly calling people out for little petty stuff.
You have to stop. You have to stop your work. It takes from your energy, your enthusiasm for what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to put out all these little fires constantly. Mm-hmm. And it just drains your energy and your focus.
Yeah.
You cannot be productive when you're constantly putting out little fires.
Yeah. Well, I just saw the other day, there were some attacks against Rachel Denhollander, and Rachel is a friend, and I really respect her. I really respect the work that she does. She's genuinely out there just struggling the rest of us.
For sure.
And this kind of work is not glamorous.
It wasn't her choice.
Not right. So it's not something that she was like, I'm going to go into advocacy and, I'm going to become rich going into advocacy. No person goes into this doing that. So, she's legitimately out there. She just drug her entire family in the car, her and Jacob and the kids, and they drove several hours up to Ohio. She just had a thing in Hudson, Ohio, a couple nights ago. So, I'm seeing some of these attacks on her on Twitter rather, and people just need to get a life. She's out there, and you may not agree with everything that she does, but she's certainly not an evil person. She's not. And she's just one example. But, this is being done to so many advocates who are genuinely good people. And I don't agree with the way that every other advocate does things. I would do things a million different ways, and they would do things different than I do it. And that's okay.
Oh, Jimmy, we know people would do things different than you.
Trust me, I'm okay with that.
I know.
I would do things differently than I do them.
I make light of it, but we're each individual is trying to do a really hard work. It's draining. And in the case of, I'll use Rachel again, it's not easy to be out in the front line like that. You're an easy target. How much nicer if people were being supportive, and if we could just overlook
or join her
or just overlook the things that we don't necessarily agree with. We don't have to agree on everything in order to be in the front lines fighting for something.
Yeah. I mean, the second point that I wanted to make was, when people attack the advocate, I think a lot of that is just emotional reactions instead of fact finding. Right. So it's this, I get roped into these stupid tweets, and
yes, you do.
Pardon the being blunt, but
yes, you do.
So if anybody listens and you rope me into these, please don't, because I just don't have the time for it, and I don't care. I don't have the interest. But it's like, why aren't you denouncing this advocate? Why don't you call out this advocate? Why aren't you? And I just, because I have no interest, because I don't, that's not where I want to spend my time. Because it's an endless abyss, and it's a cesspool when you start looking for faults in other people who are out here really genuinely working their butts to the grind to try to help people.
Absolutely. When we are nitpicking, we are always going to find a little flea or a little bug. Always.
Yeah.
And why nitpick? What's it prove?
Right.
What is the worth?
Right.
What is the value?
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to make decisions that are probably maybe bad or could be done better or could be done different. And that's okay. Like,
we're learning together,
right?
All of us, everyone who is advocating.
Right.
This is uncharted territory.
Right. So
right.
I think it's just these emotional reactions that are really not helpful. Now, if there's an advocate out there who's hurting people, who's intentionally hurting people, I say intentional because that word's really important, because we've hurt people, and people have let us know by certain podcasts that we've done where we've said something that was triggering for somebody, or, we've said something that just could have been stated differently. That's okay. Like, it's okay to talk to people about that.
That's
right?
how we learn.
But,
Sure.
We've had people respectfully talk to us about that. And, we make changes and happily do so. But it's this emotional reaction when somebody makes a misstep and you start denouncing them as somebody who's not fit for advocacy and those sorts of things. That's an emotional reaction. That's not based on fact. So, the people who masquerade as advocates, who legitimately are hurting people and intentionally hurting people, I'll shout from the rooftop and call them down. We should call them down. But that's not the trend that I'm seeing. I'm seeing a lot of really good advocates who, people just have disagreements with, and they want everybody and their mother to denounce them and call them down publicly. And I think it's just stupid. I think it's a waste of time. And then another thing is where, we blur oppression with differences of opinion. There's a radical difference between oppressing others, which should be denounced. That should be publicly denounced. We should call out. We should cry out. We should call names. When somebody's oppressing somebody else and they're doing that intentionally and they're causing harm to a person, absolutely call that out. But when we blur the lines between oppression and having a difference of opinion, we get into really dangerous territory. And that's more the trend that I see, where, man, there aren't many advocates out there to begin with, because it's hard work. And we talked in a previous podcast about the burnout rate. I mean, the burnout rate is tremendous because there's this emotional weight that you carry, and you hear stories that they just don't stop, and they're heavy and they're hurtful. And
that's just one more reason why we need to be building up instead of trying to poke holes in somebody. We need to be by each other's side and help each other, aid each other, keep each other firmed up and standing. It's a weary, lonely journey. It's a hard road to travel, being an advocate.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me in Philippians, Paul was he was really being called down by these other preachers. These other preachers were going out, and their intentions were really bad. Like, they wanted to take him out because they didn't like him. But ironically, the gospel message that they were preaching was true and accurate. They just were people that they wanted to take Paul down. So Paul said, whether from true motives or false, it doesn't matter, only that the gospel of Christ is preached. And I really like that, because he didn't give any time or attention to the people who were genuinely trying to hurt him. And, I think we need to do the same thing. Even if there are people out there who are calling out other advocates and things like that, like, if they're doing good work and their work is legitimate and true, then I'm not going to publicly call them out, because it becomes this endless cycle. And where does it ever stop?
I'm going to interject a real life little mini story here about how this attacking oppression can hurt. I was many years ago a young, inexperienced preacher's wife. And there were a group of ladies who, for whatever reason, just didn't like how I did things. I did not clean how they liked the parsonage to be cleaned. I did not have my children trained, I guess, how they thought they should be trained.
I was trained well.
Yeah. You were one
I'm just going to throw that in there.
Okay. You were a training and oh boy. But on and on and on. I didn't vacuum properly. It was all these little things. And it got to the point where some of these ladies would drive around the parsonage checking on things like, is the yard picked up? Well, your kids had no place to play. You played on the porch. There was no yard there. One lady said because we put a fence around that little plot in the city that it looked like we were farming animals. Those things were hurtful.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest with you, my heart was young and on fire for Jesus. Young and on fire. But every time an assault like this was brought to a men's meeting and I was told about it, it hurt just a little bit more and it dampened me just a little bit more to the point of where I finally figured, you know what, I just do nothing. And it really was a discouragement.
Mm-hmm.
And it took a long time for me to get back in what I would call on fire for doing God's work.
Yeah, and that's just routine serving. Like,
right.
I mean, when you take that to another level, when you're in advocacy and you are in the trenches with
Yep.
people, you're running empty. I mean, you are constantly
right.
on fumes.
And so I want people to think what it does when you constantly find little tiny flaws. And we're talking little tiny microscopic flaws. We all have them. We are all imperfect. None of us will always say the exact right thing or do the exact perfect action. None of us. So
Right.
Get over it.
Well, and I was talking to another advocate recently who was under attack, and it happens so often. I mean, it just happens really, really often,
Mm-hmm.
and I've had countless conversations with other advocates where they'll call me up and say, "Hey, I'm being attacked again,"
Yeah.
and they may ask for advice or they may just be
Mm-hmm.
venting, and one time is too often. But I mean, I've had countless conversations like this with other advocates. So one was fairly recently, and this other advocate said, if people would just spend that amount of time and energy that they're using that's directed against me and just go out and serve their neighbors, like that would be
Absolutely
incredible.
Wonderful. Yes.
And
yes.
she made a statement and said, like half in jest, but this really stuck with me. She said, go to a neighbor's house and pick weeds.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like,
that.
that's an interesting concept because
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes in advocacy, there's this really big temptation to feel needed and important. And like the work you're doing is really, really legitimate work. And you slowly drift to this place where pulling weeds is beneath you. And I think we need this reminder that pulling weeds is not beneath any of us.
You know what's beautiful about pulling weeds? We make space for flowers to bloom.
Yeah.
And I love that analogy. I love it when we get dirty, helping someone else. We're just making room for more flowers to bloom. And that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
It truly is. We need to help each other, people.
Yeah.
We truly do.
But, I look around too and look at some of the stuff that, we do and don't tell anybody about it. And, everything from giving people rides to, just constantly every day, we just go out and you just do it,
Right.
like none of that stuff is beneath us. And it's wonderful. It's great to see somebody smile. If that's all that you do is you help somebody and you put a smile on their face, I think you've spent your time well.
I would amen that times 1,000,
Yeah.
Jimmy.
I think we need to remember, like, it's already ugly enough in advocacy, but we don't need to make it any uglier.
I love that.
Yeah. We need to make it prettier.
Yeah.
We need to make it nicer.
Yes.
We need to make it somewhat enjoyable and compatible for advocates to work together. And, we're all going to do things differently, and that's quite all right. That's fine. Yep. But I love Paul's approach, because he just he doesn't call them out. He doesn't write about it. He just says, you know what, leave them alone. And
I have a work to do, and we're going to do it.
I have work to do. They're doing work, and I'm not going to give any attention to them trying to call me out. It doesn't matter. So the next thing, that's the attacks on the advocate, when leadership attacks the advocate. What about when leadership deceives the trusting? One of the things that I think is really universal is that when people are survivors, especially, the ability to trust others is really difficult. It's really challenging because your trust has been broken at the deepest level. When you're abused, somebody took something that was true and pure, and they defiled it, and they did it on purpose. And oftentimes they did it repeatedly. And oftentimes it's somebody who's in a position of trust who did this to you. So it becomes really difficult to trust people again. So when leadership deceives those who do trust, you're creating an immense amount of damage. We need to be building trust and not deceiving people who do trust. So there are a couple points, and I think just creating confusion is never okay. So when you create confusion, that's a deceptive technique. And a lot of churches do this when they try to get ahead of allegations of abuse. So they deceive the trusting, and they create this cloud of confusion. And, they're vague with the information they announce, if they announce anything at all.
And in the world of advocacy, especially within our churches, what's even more sad is I believe that this creates an even further falling away from God. I found that to be true in myself till I got a grip on things.
Yeah.
When you can't trust your leadership within a church, you begin to question God himself.
Yeah.
And
your trust for God starts to wane.
It does.
Yeah.
And that's a terrible thing.
Mm-hmm.
That absolutely terrible, because, if you can't trust these people who are men and women of God, who then can you trust? And it punches holes in everything. So you're so right on all of this.
Yeah. I mean, the second is kind of like it. It's a cousin to it, but misinformation, that's never okay. Creating confusion is not okay, but how do we create confusion? We do that through misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
So, there was a video, somebody posted this, a friend of mine posted it. I think it was yesterday. But it was yesterday. So it was a reporter in Memphis who was at a school, and a guy was filming his TV as the news was on, and he was dying of hysteria. It was hilarious. So it's fun. It's funny, but it's not. It's really sad. But these people are so worked up over the coronavirus that there's somebody standing there with a can of aerosol or something.
Lysol,
and was spraying down.
That was
this
so
kid.
Doggone funny, yeah.
And then this lady, you can hear the guy. He's like, "Wait for it!" And then the camera pans, and there's this lady, and she's covered in little Walmart garbage, the little plastic baggies.
I saw that, yeah.
And it was for real.
Yes.
And I'm like,
yeah,
it's funny, but it's sad. This is what this misinformation and confusion creates. And people are legitimately spending money that they don't have, buying mountains of toilet paper, and you can't even buy on Amazon hand sanitizer.
Nope.
It's on Amazon.
Right.
It's wiped out.
Yeah.
It's senseless. I'm all for precautions, and I'm not making light of the coronavirus, because it is.
No, neither one of us are doing that.
It's like the flu. I mean, It is the flu. It's just a different strand. And, you always take the flu seriously when you get it. And people with autoimmune deficiencies are susceptible
And go
to.
ahead and say it, Jimmy. Old
And
people.
yeah, I wasn't going to say it. I'm trying to be nice here.
Old people are really prone to this.
So there is a threat to a certain
But
amount of
it's
people.
like, pay
but
attention to the fact. I'm still scratching my head over why we don't have toilet paper on our shelves. And, you know,
I know.
the whole thing has blown up and gotten out of control, which happens when misinformation is circulating.
Yeah. So, you know, it's really important to just communicate truth and clearly. And, you know, I often go days without putting a post on social media because sometimes I just don't have things to say. And, you know, some people are so busy posting articles and posting blog posts. And, you know, I very rarely will post anything that I haven't read first because anymore you have to vet. There's so much misinformation out there.
Yes.
That I want to make sure that I've fact checked everything and really made sure that it's true before I post anything. And that's exhausting. It's time consuming. But that's just kind of what I do. I've posted, I'd say in the last 8 years or so, I've probably posted two, maybe 4 tops articles that ended up, they weren't real. The stories weren't real, or something was debunked, or it was a bad news source or whatever. And it, you know, it's embarrassing and it makes you look bad and it makes you look like you're an alarmist and all this stuff. So, you know, I try to be really, really careful. And I think that's important because misinformation just creates this mass hysteria, which isn't helpful if we're trying to combat abuse.
Not at all.
We've got to be factual.
There's enough confusion out there without creating more.
So stretching the truth is not okay either. And I mean, we could go 100 different angles with this. I've seen people give trainings where they just throw these numbers out there. And I'm like, wait a second, where did you get these numbers from? You know, whether they're talking about pornography use or you name it. That's not helpful. If we're stretching the truth,
never, we can,
in any direction, it's not helpful. So, you know, when leadership deceives people, they deceive the trusting by stretching the truth. That's never okay either. And then finally, isolating the trusting is not okay. This one is a big one. Telling people that they need to distrust others and cut off their friends. That's dangerous. That's dangerous.
Jimmy and I were talking about this prior to the podcast, and I said, if that's not a bunch of red flags waving, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
That you're right. That's treading dangerous.
I mean, that's a common tactic that abusers use, where they isolate their victims and tell them, well, you know, there's not really anybody you should trust. Boy, people out there are so untrusting. But I'll be your best friend. I'll be somebody who you can always trust. You know, they assert themselves as this trustworthy person. I tell people, yeah, there are bad people out there. There are abusers out there, certainly. There are bad people within our churches. Every church has a small percentage of people. Every police department has a small percentage of people who are bad apples that can't be trusted. But the flip side of that is, there are lots of people. The majority of people can be trusted. And, you know, to an extent.
We need the community and the fellowship
we need that.
Of each other. We need it. We crave it. We have to have it. That's the atmosphere in which we flourish.
Yeah.
And when we become so deceived, to the point of where we're told to cut off all ties with everyone, that's scary.
And especially people who've been abused.
Yes.
If they're being told that you need to cut off ties, they've already lost a lot of their friends, a lot of their family. They're already isolated. So to tell them that, oh, you shouldn't trust anybody out there, and you should probably just cut off your friends, and, you know, it's better to be by yourself than to have 2 bad friends who, you know, are going to hurt you. Well, that's a dangerous message to be telling people, to tell them that you need to isolate yourself. I think a healthier message is be careful who you surround yourself with. Use discernment. And if you feel like you just don't have the energy to do that, we can find people who will help you discern who's trustworthy and who's not, but you need friends.
There are levels of trust also. There are things that I would tell you in trust that I'm not going to tell Joe Schmo at the grocery store.
Right.
But I don't, I trust Joe Schmo to the point that he's going to help me with my groceries. He's going to help me, do whatever I need to do at that time. So you're right. We need to be discerning with our levels of trust. But when we're told mistruths, when the truth is stretched, when we're given misinformation and then told you need to isolate yourself, those are danger zones.
Oh, yeah.
For all of us.
Major red flags.
Yeah.
Major red flags.
Yes.
So hopefully that helps people to think through this. And, I would just urge people when you find yourself getting really emotional and you start pointing fingers at people, just have a sense of self-awareness and take a step back, take a few days, take a break from social media for a few days. I do it routinely.
And so do I. Absolutely.
Anymore, it's about every week.
It's good for my mental health.
A couple of days where I just step back and I don't want to get on. I don't want to post, and I just take a step back. And I think that's healthy. I'm not saying that everybody has to do that. Again, what works for me might not work for you. But if you find yourself at that place where you're just looking for blood, that's not healthy. And we've got a mission. All of us have a mission to help other people who are in need. So I guess our truth bomb that we'll leave you with is take a stop, take a breath, find a literal neighbor who's close to your house and pick some wheat. Go help them, find something to do that's going to help them, that's going to bless them. And that is not beneath you. Go find somebody and help them and then regroup and come back and come out and keep fighting the fight. Well, thank you for tuning in to this 91st episode, and we'll catch you next one.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. Thank you to our patrons who make this podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker, subscribe on Google Play Music, Apple Podcast, or Stitcher. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.